Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Progverse. We're going to be doing a show tonight here on Prog Monster, which is the Big Six. So, for those of you who don't know what the Big Six are, the Big Six of prog music, really. So, most channels on YouTube that do this kind of thing all know who the Big Six are, the Big Six prog bands. All British bands coming out between that period of time from like the mid 60s through to the early 70s. Album wise, probably later in the 60s to earlier in the 70s as well. But all six of them are British. And so the question always begs, why these six? Why not some other six? Why are they all British? Why only that period of time? These are all questions that I sought some answers for this week, tried to get some. One of the places I sought answers is I went to the Prog Corner. This is a show put on by Scott Lade, YouTuber. Yeah, probably one of the most, if not the most knowledgeable progressive rock guy out here doing this kind of stuff. I enjoy his stuff a lot. He seems to be bang on with a lot of stuff too, even his kind of unorthodox style, but still some really great insights into stuff. I did like the answer that he gave to why these six bands. So he talked a little bit about how he put together his 100 favorite albums. And when he was done, about a third of them came from these six bands. That in itself is an answer. That's the answer to why these six prog bands, because they are the most listened to bands in general by most people who like prog music. I'm no exception to that rule. I went through the albums that I would have put in my top 100, and almost 30, somewhere between 30 and 35 of them were from these six bands. Now, in my case, only 5 of those bands, because there's one of those 6 bands I really don't follow. I don't dislike them. I've never had any problem with them, but I've never really followed them, so I can't really say too much about them, but I will talk a little bit about them tonight. So who are those 6 bands you're saying, if you're new, and maybe you're new to prog and you don't know who they are? Well, it's pretty simple. King Crimson, Yes, Genesis, Pink Floyd, Jethro, Tull, and ELP are the 6 bands. All progressive rock bands, all hailing from the magical island of music, I call it. So why not any of the American bands? Why not, say, Kansas or Renaissance or one of those bands? Why not Rush from Canada? Many people would put these as one of their big 6. I think it's essentially what Scott said, that most people have albums from these 6 in their top 100. They may have one of those other bands that I said, but almost all of them would have them. Now, maybe at some point, Rush being one of my favorite bands, Rush would be in there as well. However, a lot of people, there's often a little bit of an argument between whether Rush is actually if that's their main genre, prog, or maybe they're metal or the hard stuff at very least. I think with Rush, it's kind of a combination of all 3. I think that's what sets them to this genre, is that they're kind of a heavier kind of prog band than most. Maybe the forerunner to some of these later progressive metal bands like Dream Theater and Queensryche, and there's a few others that come to mind too. But I'm thinking that these 6 bands, though, have had huge influence on just about everybody in the genre. And even though they're not necessarily my 6, I would probably substitute a couple of them for a couple of others. But those are the ones that are generally thought of as that. So maybe there might be some point in time where people start saying, we're going to make a new big 6 and change the bands. Maybe some of these will stay. Maybe some of them new ones will come in. But at this point in time, those are the bands that they've put in this category. And I think they deserve a little bit of conversation because they've all, in my opinion, they've all had some of the very best rock albums released. And they've also had some of the very worst rock albums released. So I've picked out 3 from each of the bands and just discussed them, and I may discuss some of the other albums as well when we're as we're going along, as it seems impromptu to do. So we'll start with King Crimson. So the reason I decided to start with King Crimson is because in many ways they're considered the first prog band. Well, I don't know if they're considered the first prog band, but this is definitely considered the first prog album in the Court of the Crimson King. I love the album cover. I love all the stuff on it. The funny thing about King Crimson for me is that up until recent time, like since I started the channel, I had only really heard about this album, and I had dismissed it as I listened to it a couple of times and said, this stuff is really weird. It's really too far progressive for me. Like it's out of the realm of where I want to go. And so I kind of dismissed them as being almost unrealistic music. I didn't think it was even actually music. I will confess that that's the way I thought of this album initially. And so I never got to albums like Lark's Tongues and Aspen, or the current one that's going into my playlist soon, Stainless and Bible Black. So I have several. For those of you who've been following me, what I've been doing with the King Crimson is I'm working my way from the first album through the entire discography, and I'm up to Starless and Bible Black now. There we are. So for me, King Crimson, yeah, they're too far. They were too far one way for me to get into. And maybe that might have had something to do with my youth. I suspect that I wasn't into that as much. In that time period when I discovered them, my friend had brought them over and we talked about it, but I wasn't in that mode. I was still into mostly hard rock. That was primarily my thing. And wasn't really interested in moving too far into that progressive rock. Yes, there was some stuff that was definitely progressive that I did listen to occasionally. Some Styx, some Rush. Like my first Rush album was Moving Pictures. That's as proggy as it probably got for me. And for that time period, I was fine. But I started in the early 80s to move into the genre. And this was just a little too far for me on one side. But I've grown to love that album. It's probably at this point my favorite King Crimson album. That may change. This album, I think, is very good too. This moves maybe a little further than King Crimson with its kind of fusion sound to it. There's a lot of fusion sound to this album. I'm not really into fusion music. That may change because I wasn't really into prog music at one time either. And I may move that way. But I like this album quite a bit. It's probably at this point in time my second favorite King Crimson album. I have a whole bunch more to listen to before I really decide which my favorite is. This one is next up on the list for a reason. It's number 6 on the list. And I suspect the next several King Crimson albums are going to make them a much stronger band for me ultimately. But they're very good, but they take it to the almost extreme in my own opinion. But I can see why they've had such an impact on so many other bands too. So the second band up is, for one point in my history, was my favorite rock band. A period of history that went from probably the early 80s, like 82 or so, all the way up to the early part of this century, like 2000, 2001, in that around that area. They were probably my favorite band for a good 19 years. And a lot of that time period was me just kind of coasting along and not really expanding my music horizon and not really going into anything new. So I was basically living on the laurels of this band's past, which was Yes, of course. This is the album that I think kind of started that sound of Yes. The previous two albums had bits and pieces of that, but this one really like solidified that sound. The other albums I chose for this was this one, which I also think is a little bit of a jazz fusion, but not as far over as Lark's Tongues and Aspic, in my own opinion. But this is one of their albums that actually didn't make a masterpiece for me. Most of the other ones around this time period were masterpieces. Fragile, Yes album, Close to the Edge, Tormato, Drama. These albums are all masterpieces for me. But for some reason, this one and its follow-up album, Going for the One, really didn't make that masterpiece for different reasons. This one because I thought it was too fusiony and I just too far one way for me. Going for the One, I actually found that one, even though it in hindsight, I don't know why I came to that conclusion. I found it a little too almost commercial sounding, but it was only the one track that really had that on there. The rest of them weren't commercial sounding at all. So, probably just my limited exposure to them. And then I also chose this one, which is their most recent album. As has been with so many of their albums over the last half dozen to dozen years, great album covers, fantastic. The music hasn't always lived up to the album covers. I do like Fly From Here quite a bit. I did like The Ladder. I'm currently listening to the Keys to Ascension. I know it's a little bit before what I'm talking about, but I did like those, or I am getting into those now. This one I thought was a good album. And I can say that having listened to almost everything later and saying, I have to say I was a bit disappointed in some of the stuff that they did at that time. Not that I don't think I've never had a Yes album that I thought was garbage. There's none like that. Even the opening, their first album, which I thought was very weak, wasn't necessarily a bad album. And I don't think they have really any bad albums. But I think this one's a step up. Maybe the best album they've put out in decades. And, it's a pretty solid album. I like John Davison's singing, but I don't think he's John Anderson either. I think if John Anderson was to rejoin this band, and he's proven that by doing his own true album with the Band of Geeks, which is very, the first half dozen tracks on that album are very Yes-like and could easily be part of this discography. And he's proven that they can still do that if they were to put his voice on. So as much as I like John Davison, and I don't think he'll be leaving the band anyways, I think if John Anderson was to rejoin, the combination of him and Steve Howe, if they actually worked together, could put out some pretty substantial stuff. And they've had the magic in the past. There's no reason to think they couldn't do it again. Anyways, Yes, probably a favorite band of mine initially. They've since lost back to Rush, and Rush has taken over again. But amongst these prog albums that we're doing here, they're one of my favorite. The next band out, very different in style. Once again, those first two who had some connections with each other. John Anderson doing a little singing on one of the King Crimson albums. Bill Bruford, of course, playing drums with them at some point as well. However, even there's a little bit of a connection between the two, not as much with this next band. This next band is very different type of prog music, almost a spacey feel to some of their music. And of course, we're talking about Pink Floyd. Now, some people even actually say that Pink Floyd is not prog music. Well, it's not as, I would say, it's not as complex. Well, I can't even say that. It's pretty complex, but it's not as strong in the instrumentation. Like there are points where it has very strong instrumentation, but overall, I would not say these guys are in the same league as some of these other bands. However, when it comes to putting music and sounds together and making some absolute great, complex kind of stories, if you want, nobody does it better than Pink Floyd. The lyrics are fantastic. The ideas are fantastic. The way in which they use sounds and different types of soundscapes to create a tie together between their songs, specifically on this album, but more on some of the other albums as well. Very innovative, very different, and pushing the edges all the time. So Pink Floyd, definitely that to me is a progressive rock album. This one is also a progressive rock album. I chose this one because it's probably my favorite Pink Floyd album, as it is with many people who listen to prog. Many people say that this is their favorite album. I personally think it's the heaviest of all the Pink Floyd albums as well. Almost in that metal realm, not quite, but definitely leaning towards that direction. Lots of really strong stuff on this as well. Another kind of story-ish type album, maybe loosely or maybe strongly, depending on how you want to view it. Great album. I like this one too, even though this is actually a film theme, but there's just something about this album that's really catchy. Yeah, a lot of the songs are a little bit incomplete, left out parts, or seem like they're not finished quite, but there's a lot of really good stuff on this album, as there is on some of their other stuff too, like this. But Obscured by Clouds, I think, is good, and I even like more a bit too, even though it's a little bit more geared towards the movie. This one I think is just fantastic, though, in many ways. I like the cover as well, and they have lots of stuff that's in between all these albums that's quite good as well. The other thing about Pink Floyd, though, unlike my story about Yes, is that Pink Floyd has a number of albums that I think are very weak, and there's a couple that come to mind that I actually don't like. One of them is The Final Cut. I've never warmed up to that album. I don't like anything about it. It's kind of like I wasn't a big fan of The Wall. In fact, for years I didn't like The Wall. I kind of like it now. It's definitely on the plus side, but this just seems like my problem with The Wall was that there was a number too many filler songs on it. If they cut it down a little bit, I probably would have liked it more, or at least took out some of the filler. I probably would have liked it more. And the Final Cut seems like it's stuff that's didn't even make that genre. I just don't like it. I think it's a pretty weak album, to be honest. Other albums that I have never warmed up is Amagama. It's just this, to me, it's just a strange album. Doesn't really fit in anywhere. Yeah, I just can't listen to it. It's just to me, it's just not really that good. Now, some people might say the same about Atom Heart Mother, but for some reason, that album sits with me a lot better. I actually like this album a lot. It's going to be a top 5 Pink Floyd album for me, no doubt about it. You know, and the other one I've had a hard time with is the one with echoes on it. Now, I do like the 2 tracks that people often cite, the opening track and the final track on the album, but there's too much filler in the middle, and the album could have been much better. And I know a lot of people really like it and think it's one of their best albums. At least Echoes is a great song. I can't take anything away from that, but I just never really warmed to that. So for me, Pink Floyd has a lot of stuff up here, a few things in the middle, and then a couple of too many at the bottom. And that's part of the thing that I don't like about them. So we're going to go on to the next band. I'm going to drink here first before I dehydrate. This is probably my second favorite band now. In the recent year, they've passed Yes and I feel like they're probably my second favorite band now, and they just put out another album recently. But we're just going to talk about some of the stuff I like about them. So this is one of the most proggy albums by them, thick as a brick. 2 sides, 1 song. Nobody else was doing that. They were almost trying to make a tongue-in-cheek statement about, well, people are making prog. We're going to go all out and make 1 song on an album just to be almost ridiculous. The whole concept of this young boy creating this album is almost ludicrous if you didn't understand British humor. But it's such a great stuff. There's some really well put together instrumentation on this album. It's almost off the charts at times. It's a fantastic album. I don't listen to it as much as some of the other Jethro Tull just because of the length of it. And I tend to be a person that listens to from the beginning till the end. And I find this almost exhausting at times. But it's great, no matter how you want to put it. Great album. Many of the people who are progs of the Jethro Tull, who are fans of the prog that Jethro Tull does, cite this as the most progressive and the best album by them. And I can't make any argument against that at all, really. My favorite album by them is this one, Songs from the Wood, as I do like some of the albums that had come out in this time period, Heavy Horses being the other one. But, of course, any of the albums that had John Glasscock on it, I love. He's just fantastic. I just love his bass tone. I love everything about the way he puts forth his bass. This album is at times very, very folky. Other times very, very almost hard rockish and heavy. And there's a nice blend of both with a kind of over feel of progressive rock too. The topics are all really interesting. The songs on this album from top to bottom are, I think, the best on any Jethro Tull album. And that's probably why it's my favorite. This is really the album. I had a couple of Jethro Tull albums before this. Aqualung I didn't really get into it till much later. A Masters album I had as well. But this one was really the one that put these guys on the map for me. Absolutely killer album, and I love it. Another album that came from that same kind of time period is Minstrels in the Gallery, another fantastic album. Yeah, just Stormwatch, these are all great albums by this band. And then, they went through a long, long period where they didn't make an album, and most people figured they were done and wouldn't make any more albums. And then they came out with this guy. Album cover aside, this is a really good album. I like this. Of the 3 they've put out, they went for 19 or 20 years without putting an album out, and then put out 3 in a short period of time, like within 4 years. This was the first of those 3. I really like this album quite a bit, especially the first 4 or 5 tracks on this album. Just going to look at them. So you got Mrs. Tibbetts, Jacob's Tales, Mine is the Mountain, and The Zealot Gene. These are all really strong Jethro Tull songs. The rest of the songs kind of go between not that good to pretty good, so strong. I wish he'd done a different cover for the album. It's kind of a weird cover, but I like this album. When this came out after all that time, I thought, wow, they're good. They had changed the music. Well, the music still sounds like Jethro Tull, but they had gone to a little bit more of a different level of tone, or if you want, a different octave, and which suited his voice more. He's not singing as much as he is doing that kind of talking that they do on some vocal albums. And this one is a strong album. I like it. The next couple that they did, I didn't care as much for Rock Float as much. I thought, even though it had a concept of mythology, Norse mythology, which I've always enjoyed, the album, for whatever reason, just didn't seem to resonate very well with me. This current one, I've only listened to it once because I haven't done my new albums hauls yet. So I only did it I've only listened to it for the What's New show that I do. So I haven't had a great exposure to it, but I think it's more like the Zealot Gene. So I think I'm going to like it a lot more. So Jethro Tull. So Jethro Tull, also like King Crimson for me, took some time. Well, Pink Floyd too. Pink Floyd I didn't like initially. King Crimson I didn't like initially, and Jethro Tull I did not like initially. Each of them took their time. Took Floyd maybe 20, 25 years for me to change my tone on them. With King Crimson, there wasn't even a case of not liking them. They just didn't listen to them. It wasn't until I got in this channel that I really started to take them on. And with Jethro Tull, I did not initially like them because I never liked that song Aqualung. It wasn't until sometime in the 90s where I started to warm up to them with that Masters album that I had, and then it kind of took off. So they maybe didn't have as long a term of waiting to get on as some of the others, but still took a while for them. Now, on to the final two bands. So the next one is not going to surprise anybody. I tried to space them out a bit here and be a little bit different. So we're going to be talking about Genesis now. This is a band that I only had 2 albums by them initially in the 80s, so I did like them. Both albums, I would say they were probably a top 10 band for me, and then eventually moved up and became a top 5, but they didn't make that top 5 till the turn of the century, when I had gone through this period where I had bought a whole bunch of stuff on one particular day at Sam the Record Man's downtown Toronto in the late 80s. Maybe spent $300 on CDs, and I bought Trespass, Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, and this one. But they stayed pretty much unlistened to until almost 15 years later, maybe it was 10 years or 15 years later, when I started listening to them. And I did what I normally do, is I started with the first one and went up, and each one got better. This one, I think, is the best of those 4 that I had. And this album in recent years is kind of challenged to be my favorite Genesis album. There's just so much great stuff going on here. I think Tony Banks is at his best on this album. You still got Peter Gabriel and Stephen Hackett on here. So this is Genesis in its full form. There's like lots of really great stuff on here. First to Fifth, I Know What I Want in My Wardrobe is probably one of my favorite Genesis songs. Dancing with the Moonlit Night, of course, another great tune. And the songs were a bit longer on this album too, which I think really, they weren't like epic length. They were more like the Bytor and the Snow Dog length. And I seem to resonate very well with that type. The Battle of Epping Forest, which is very British sounding. Just really Cockney almost. Yeah, great tune though. And Cinema Show, which is probably my favorite on this album, and has an absolute great inspiring keyboard solo by Tony Banks. Yeah, just fantastic album. Genesis, I never had that issue where I had a period of time I didn't like them. I liked them initially, and it only has gotten stronger over the years. They just resonated really well with me. All their albums touched me in a different way. I chose to talk a little bit about this one, and then there were 3. And I think the reason I did is because now you're just down to the 3 guys left with Hackett and Gabriel gone. The music became a lot simpler, not as complex, more keyboard and synthesizer driven than previously. Vocals, I think, were quite clear, but the lyrics are still really good. The storylines are good. I like most of the stuff on this album. Some of it not as much, but a lot of it a lot more. So, this was the one Genesis album that kind of took a while for me to really like it. I put it and I was playing it and I was playing it. It took a while, other than Follow You, Follow Me, which I knew from the radio. The rest of them I did not know. So it took a while for this to really resonate with me. And then, of course, this is my most recent Genesis album, Seconds Out, which takes a lot of the stuff that they did on studio and expanded to a live forum, minus Peter Gabriel is not on this album, but some just absolute killer stuff on here. The Supper's Ready version of this album is fantastic, and Cinema Show is equally fantastic. And it starts out with Squonk and Carpet Crawlers. It's really great stuff. Genesis was great at putting the one band that had great like tracks that everybody heard on the radio, but also had these tracks that didn't get a lot of radio play, but were still equally as fantastic. They're the one band that does that well. All their stuff is just really great. I don't really like the post-progressive rock era that much. I do listen to it, but I'm not including a discussion about that. It's very different from anything else that they've done prior to that. We'll get on to the final band here. I'm always reluctant to talk about these guys because I don't really follow them, and I never really ever have. Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I do have 3 of their albums, though, kind of strange. Tarkus, of course. Trilogy, which is a great, well-known album by them, and their debut. So I picked out the 3 I like the best, and every once in a while I play one of them, hoping that something will connect for me. I probably should put one of them in the playlist and see if it can stick with me. But I just there are some stuff by them I quite like. I do like this album a little bit more than the other ones, their debut, and that's because it has Lucky Man on it, and Tank is on this as well. The Barbarian is decent for me too, but I'm not. I tried to figure this out, and I never could really have an answer that quite sat with me very well. They don't have a guitar player, and probably that hurts them for me. I do love everything Greg Lake does. I love his stuff on King Crimson, which helps them too. He's also a great bass player, has a fantastic voice. So he's easily my favorite member of the band. Keith Emerson, I've never really had an opinion one way or another about him. It's almost like a non-entity for me, which is probably the reason why these are not one of my favorite bands, because he's, to me, the main cog of this band. And I never really cared much for Carl Palmer. So maybe that has something to do with it. Maybe it's just the style in which they present their music. I don't really know. But I will keep playing one once in a while. I've tried recently. I played this Tarkus, and it just didn't really resonate with me. But of the 6 bands here that are considered the big 6 prog, I think Emerson, Lake and Palmer may be the most popular now. And maybe they were the most popular then too. I never really got into them. But I see a lot of people. They're often the most commented band on me. Whenever I'm doing anything involving them, there's always a ton of comments about it. Usually people accosting me for my non-belief, I guess. I kind of get it. The other 5 I like a lot. The other 5, 3 of the other 5, or 4 of the other 5 are part of my group of 9. King Crimson is one of my top 25 bands, and then Emerson, Lake and Palmer is probably down in the 100 range, and I don't know why. There's no reason for it really. If you were going back in that time period in the 70s, maybe they would have been the face of progressive rock. Maybe. I think Yes is the greatest progressive rock band of all time if you're going by this standard. Genesis may be the most popular, but Genesis' popularity really doesn't have much to do with the prog music, really, I think. Pink Floyd, in that time period where I was growing up, they were the biggest, or one of the 2 biggest bands in the world, them and Zeppelin. Maybe they've both lost something over the last couple of decades. Zeppelin more than Floyd. I think Floyd is still looked upon as great by the prog community, but a lot of people don't really listen to them anymore. I don't know what that's all about, but to me, if most of the times when they had those Battle of the Bands or Battle of the Albums on Q107 or one of the other rock stations that I listened to, it always came down to 2 or 3 bands. Zeppelin and Floyd were always among the last 2 or 3. And because I'm in Canada, Rush was always up there too. But for some reason, the Beatles never were, and that always amazed me, because many people think the Beatles are the greatest band of all time. I wouldn't argue with that. I can't find a single argument to dethrone them, but they never ever got out of the second or third round. They were always out when it came to the last 8 or 10 bands. They weren't among them. I never could understand that. It might have just been because the 70s were a different time. Music was heavier, and the Beatles were considered part of the past. It might have been just that period of time. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to say. Anyways, those to me are the big 6, as most people see them. That's my take on their music and their albums. I did do a mini series on this too. I did a mini series called The Big 6. If you want, you can go back and watch that. It's just a little more detailed on each of the bands. Not a one show, but a bunch of episodes. Yeah, would I change any of these bands out if I was? Well, I don't think King Crimson would make my big 6. And it isn't because I don't like them. I like them a lot, but I just like Rush more. And they would definitely be taking one of those spots. They would probably take the Emerson, Lake and Palmer spot. King Crimson might lose their spot to Gentle Giant, who I think belongs on this list as well. As for the other 4, they're going to be in it. I have no doubt about it. They would be in my big 6. And then you'd probably switch out King Crimson with Gentle Giant, and Rush with where you take out Emerson, Lake and Palmer for Rush. That would only be the only real changes. But I do completely understand and see why they chose this 6 as the bands. They're very quite far apart. I think of Genesis and Genesis as being almost the center. Then a little left of that would be maybe Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Yes. Then a little further out, you might get, maybe you get Jethro, Tull, then Pink Floyd further out, and then King Crimson way over here. Now, if you were to add Rush and Genesis, Gentle Giant to this list as they being 2 of my 6, I would put Rush probably in around where Yes and Genesis and Emerson, Lake and Palmer are. And then I would put Gentle Giant almost somewhere between Pink Floyd and King Crimson on the very outside. So anyways, that's just my take on all of this. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Into the Progverse, featuring the big 6 of progressive rock. It's tough to know the answers to some of those questions, like why those bands, but I think Scott laid on the Prog Corner definitely made me think about what he said, and made me understand that he's probably, if not 100% right, at least strongly indicative as to why these 6 were there. Anyways, I've said enough tonight. My mouth is getting very dry, and I'm also starting to get really tired, if you can't see it in my eyes yet. Topic I've liked quite a bit. If you got any comments about anything I've said, or maybe there's one of the bands that you are particularly in love with that you wanted to talk a little bit more about, you can do that. I have no problems with any of these bands. There's none of them. There's no animosity towards any of them. I don't dislike any of them. It's just degrees of how much I like them, I guess. And that just comes from us. And with prog music, more than any other music, it's just that switch. Something about them I like, and sometimes that takes a very long time for me with prog. But usually when I do end up liking them, they usually become one of my favorite bands. Where with hard rock and that, I usually initially like them right away, and then they may fade out, or they may not really go on to anything. Very few of them have been like torpedoed to the top and stayed there. Most of them go to the top or near to the top, and then just kind of fade slowly over time. That's normally how it works with hard rock music for me. It's a very different genre. anyways, if you want to make any comments about any of the bands, or if you want to put down who you would keep and who you might want to add and replace and why you might want to do that, you can make those kind of your questions down below. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. Those things help the channel. And I will see you next Friday for another episode of Into the Progverse. And I'm going to think about a good topic. I have a couple of them in mind. So we'll be seeing what the topic will be next time. So have yourself a good night and good evening, and we will see you next Friday. Take care and goodbye.